Mark Rogers TV, Alabama edition, talking Tide football with, of course, Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama, with the Tide just a few weeks away from the national semifinal game against the Washington Huskies in Atlanta at the Peach Bowl. All right, so this is, of course, our weekly Alabama spot, Stephen M., or as you said before we started the record, it's the second edition of the Christmas tree.
It's the second edition of our Alabama Talk featuring Jack Frost and some Christmas music in the mix.
That's it, and some very special ornaments that have a lot of history here in the Rogers family, and my kids have made throughout the years and so forth. So we'll not bore anyone anymore with the Rogers family Christmas tradition here, but we'll talk some Washington Huskies with both teams getting ready to hit the practice field soon. For Alabama, it's on Friday. Nick Saban's press conference on Friday as well. We have some injury news in the Alabama camp in regards to what's happened over the last several weeks of the season. Stephen, it's been a relatively healthy team across the board, except for in the secondary. There have been some hits there to the defensive backs, and there could be some moves that need to be made leading up to the game against Jake Browning and company.
Well, of course, the main injury that happened, we all know, Eddie Jackson, who got hurt against Texas A&M off a tackle on special teams. Minkah Fitzpatrick came in and has very much so assumed that role of safety. Has done a dynamic job tracking the football, making tackles in space, and just being a leader alongside Ronnie Harrison, Tony Brown, Marlon Humphrey, and, of course, Anthony Averett, who's had a phenomenal year, this being his first year starting. Another issue happens to be during the Southeastern Conference title game a couple of weeks ago, we had Sean Dion Hamilton, the inside linebacker from Montgomery, Alabama, Carver High School, the junior, who's usually with Reuben Foster in nickel and dime packages. Sean Dion hurt his knee against the Gators, and according to Nick Saban, he will miss the college football playoff. Now, of course, Rashaan Evans, the junior outside linebacker, took his spot, filled in for him, and did pretty well, was a part of that goal line stand in the third quarter against Florida. So you will definitely see a lot of Rashaan Evans in that nickel and dime spot, with Dion Hamilton not being able to play. Of course, Saban's press conference is tomorrow after practice, which kicks off at 4:20 to start the bowl prep. We'll hear more from Saban on that, but the general census is that Rashaan Evans will play in that nickel and dime spot with Sean Dion Hamilton out.
Over the past several years, Washington has produced a number of NFL players on that side of the football as well, talking defense. And even though they had a number of losses last season, we expected the defense to be one of the better units in college football. It hasn't disappointed here in 2016. Joe Mathis was a guy who got off to a great start, actually led the team in sacks and tackles for loss at the time of his injury way back after about 7 games played. Azim Victor, another guy, unfortunately, who's not going to see the field against the Crimson Tide.
It hurts, and I'm pretty sure Chris Peterson would have loved to have both guys in. You talk about Azim Victor, who's played 10 games this year, the junior, 67 tackles, leading the team in that regard. And before Psalm Wuching became the leader in sacks with 6, it was Joe Mathis with 5 to 5.5. So Washington, 2 big-time playmakers, 2 veterans at that linebacker position, not being able to have those guys. When you talk about trying to stop, an Alabama offense that loves to run the football, that loves to make plays in the passing game, when you're missing 2 linebackers that can eat the field, hit the A gap, the B gap, wrap up and make tackles. I understand you have that next man up mentality, but even with next man up, when you have 2 guys that are the heart and soul of your defense, it's very hard to find that next man up because they have a lot of shoes to fill.
Stephen, we understand that Nick Saban has requested game tape on Washington football, and not just Washington, going back under the Chris Peterson Boise State regime, going back like 8 years, to make sure that there is not a stone unturned when it comes to what Chris Peterson's capable of doing. And for college football fans who have been watching for less than 10 years. You may not know about the infamous Boise State play against Oklahoma when the Broncos were just emerging onto the scene in Oklahoma, a giant, and that was one of the original giant killers of the BCS era, at least Chris Peterson there. But Nick Saban knows that Chris Peterson is capable of finding that wrinkle or something that could break a game open.
This is the one time where if you're an Alabama Crimson Tide fan, I know the crimson glasses look glamorous and you enjoy seeing through them, but this is the one moment where you have to peer away from those glasses for just a bit, because Peterson is the original Dragon Slayer. You mentioned, Mark, became the head coach of Boise State in 2006. Not a lot of people gave that team respect, the likes of Jarrett Zambransky and Legadou Nene and Ian Johnson and that entire crew. And they entered that year, people thinking, well, they're just Boise State. They should be happy to be there. They're not going to give much of a fight to Oklahoma, who was one of the toasts of college football. And Chris Peterson, his teachings of hard work, work ethic, execution, and also playing with a lot of toughness. And the guys bought in. They went out there. They took care of not only Oklahoma, but also TCU a couple of years later in that Fiesta Bowl against a team coached by Gary Patterson, who had a 15-game win streak going into that 2010 Fiesta Bowl off that 09 season. So Peterson, definitely the original Dragon Slayer. And if there's anybody 15 days time to prepare and is going to have his guys ready to go, would be Chris Peterson.
And as you well know, Stephen, he's done it at the other end of the season when he was in Boise. He went to the Georgia Dome one year and completely embarrassed the Bulldogs and Mark Richt. Virginia Tech was a top 10 team, and they played at the state capitol or somewhere close to Washington, D.C., and Boise State pulled off that game against the Hokies early on when Virginia Tech was a power that particular season. We're talking about the past 7 or 8 years there in college football. One other thing I'd like to hit you up on it here, Stephen, is you mentioned the Dragon versus the Dragon Slayer, the David versus Goliath scenario. We can throw out all the cliches when it concerns Alabama and Washington in this one, because we haven't seen a point spread in this caliber of a game in quite some time. The line came out at 11, and it just keeps to zoom its way up. Now, Alabama is going to be a substantial favorite against any team in college football, probably Ohio State and Clemson the least. Even some powers outside of the college football playoff would be given much greater of a chance against the Tide than Washington, speaking about Michigan in particular. But when it comes to Washington, that line just keeps creeping up. The public really likes Bama. Of course, Vegas did from the outset. Do you think there's a particular reason Washington maybe not given quite the respect that some of the other top teams around college football are?
Absolutely. This is a Washington team that, keep in mind, Mark, prior to this season, the last time it won a conference championship was 2000, and the last time it won its conference outright was 1991. So there's not a lot of respect being thrown to Washington, but Chris Peterson finally has a program and a team that mirrors exactly what he had at Boise State. You go back to Jake Browning, 3,000-yard passer. He's got 42 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. Who does he remind you of from Boise? Jarrett Zambransky, Kellen Moore. Very cerebral, very accurate quarterback. You look at the run game. Washington with Myles Gaskin, a 1,000-yard rusher. He's averaging 103 yards per game. And LaVon Coleman. Who do those guys remind you of? How about Ian Johnson, Jeremy Avery, and Doug Martin from Boise State? Tough-nosed backs, can run in between the tackles, also break it to the outside. For Washington, it's got a lot of talented receivers, but the two main guys, Don and John Ross. John Ross, who leads, who's second nationally in touchdown receptions, behind the likes of Louisiana Tech's Carlos Henderson. Who do those two guys remind you of, Mark? You look at Austin Pettis, Titus Young at Boise State. Boise State had a lot of big-time receivers, but Young and Pettis were the main two. Defensively, it stands the same way. Toughness at both ends. Peterson's finally got a team that mirrors what he once had and that made him a star all of those years with the Broncos. Alabama is in for a fight, and if you look at it, despite the pass rush that the Crimson Tide presents with Jonathan Allen, Tim Williams, Ryan Anderson, the list goes on, Jake Browning gets that ball out of his hands in 2 seconds. And it doesn't matter how good your pass rush is, if that quarterback's got the ball out of his hands to those receivers before you can get to him, the pass rush is not going to matter.
I also think what's hurt this, the credibility of this team coming into the college football playoff, no fault of its own, is that the Pac-12 is down this year. The Pac-12 has been, most notably, most observers would say, the second best conference in college football over the past several seasons. It's still extremely deep. So really not bad teams in the Pac-12, but no elite teams in the Pac-12. So a glut of good teams, glut of top 40 type teams, a lot of Utahs, a lot of schools like that. Stanford's fallen off this year. So Washington didn't get that. They also, because of the scheduling, didn't step out of conference to play anybody like an Ohio State going to Oklahoma this year. Alabama stepping out against USC. And when they did get that one team, and it was at home, that is considered a giant in college football, both in terms of national respect and history and that sort of thing, but also in regards to the talent on the field. Even though they weren't playing well at the time, they got USC once, and they didn't get blown out, but they didn't look good, and they were down by 2 scores most of the game and completely outclassed in that game. And that was really the one team that Washington could have pointed to say, hey, we beat a team that trots out consistent 4 stars and some 5 stars, and we got the job done. But they didn't.
They absolutely didn't. And that, you're definitely right about that, Mark. That does swing a downer to that side. But then you look at the SEC, though usually pretty productive years, has not been the best year for the SEC either. Of course, Alabama, you can't blame the Crimson Tide. You go out there and you win a football game. Are you going to tell Nick Saban, don't have your guys buy into the process, have your guys throw a football game, not to have your guys focus? No, that's ludicrous. Nick Saban's going to have his guys beyond focused, beyond prepared, beyond ready, because that's the type of coach that he is. On the flip side, it's the same way that Chris Peterson is. This is going to be a very interesting ball game, and it comes down to the quarterback play, Mark. Can Jake Browning get the ball out of his hands quickly, target his guys downfield? Can Jalen Hurts not make mistakes? This 15 days of bowl prep are going to be very important for him. Can he finally get the fine-tuned passing? Because this starts a whole new season. This ushers in 2017. This ushers in a new year. Can Hurts get the fine-tuned grasp of how to scan the field, locate guys, make wise decisions with the football? It starts against Washington. If he can get that done, Alabama can continue to roll and get to the national championship game. And on the flip side for Jake Browning, despite the fact that he may not be mobile, if he can fire that ball out of his hands in 2 seconds, recognize how to move the chains, get the ball to Ross and Dante Pettis, this is going to be a fun one.
It's our Wednesday edition of Mark Rogers TV. It's the Alabama edition with Mr. Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama. You can join him right there with plenty of insight into the Crimson Tide. Of course, the All-SEC team coming out in recent weeks, the All-America teams, a lot of breakdowns concerning that, concerning, of course, this matchup against the Washington Huskies coming up in just a few weeks. Washington, about a 17-point underdog right now against the Tide as we near New Year's Eve. And we'll really dig into the nuts and bolts of the offense versus defensive and special teams matchups with Stephen here in the next few weeks. All right, Stephen, we appreciate the time, man.
No problem, Mark. Thank you.